So a key part of our mission to understand people and inspire growth here at Kantar is truly ensuring that the data that we offer to clients really reflects the diverse world that we share. And that can often mean shining a spotlight on underrepresented groups, but also behaviours as well. Look, there's no doubt that to win in the 2020s, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and tech-enabled automation are a key part of ensuring that we deliver insights at the speed and scale of life. But so too is the fact that we need to represent the emotions that differentiate us humans from bots. So bringing out the best in the collaboration between machines and humans is also a really important part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. Because let's face it, as humans, we're not always rational and our behaviour is not always predictable. So this is why today we're really excited to be able to take you through some of the thought leadership we've been doing on enabling empathetic survey designs. And what we mean by that is when you invite respondents to answer your questions, you actually enable them to show up and answer the questions as their true selves. Essentially what we're asking you to do is to put yourselves in their shoes and really ensure that the truthful responses that they really do live and die by actually make meaningful sense and come out to the fore of the data. For example, there may be some questions you ask with the right intentions, but actually make people feel judged or actually make them feel a little bit stupid. Or are there times where you actually need to delve into areas or topics that actually people have quite strong opinions on, but aren't necessarily comfortable with expressing them or sharing them? There are other times where people feel that they need to aspire to answer the question as opposed to really reflecting what they actually really do in their everyday lives. And frankly, there are lots of questions at the moment where people feel that they might be being judged if they give the honest answer to it. And so these are areas that we really need to be mindful of. There are also times where we ask people questions where actually we don't honestly know how to actually answer the question. You know, how many units of alcohol do you drink? Do you really know what a unit stands for and how many that represents in a week? And there may be times at Kantar we are lucky that we have a direct relationship with respondents through our exclusive Life Points panels. And from this, we're able to say that people, the main bit of feedback that we receive from our panellists is that they can often find surveys quite boring to do. And this is what frustrates them the most. An example of this may be if you've got a brand questionnaire and you need to ask a long list of brands, but each brand has a loop of around 20 questions, asking the same question over and over again, you can really start to see drop-off from respondents really wanting to give their best or even actually finish the survey itself.
What does it look like in practice? Well, empathetic survey design is about removing the judgment from the way we ask questions. Look, I'm sorry to say, but we can all be, as market researchers, a little bit judgmental in some of the questions we ask. You know, what is your highest level of education? How much do you earn? What's your working status? Or how old are you? I mean, all of these have an inherent judgment. Essentially, you know, highest education, higher is good. Earning an income is good, and a high one at that is better. When we ask about working status, we're putting the focus on work, as if to say other lifestyles are less valued or less important in society. Asking how old you are, there's a bit of a judgment in that, and it's felt by some, and certainly when they reach a certain age. Now, essentially, all of this can put people in a position to feel the need to lie or to exaggerate the truth. And what we end up as researchers is with data that is poor quality. So basically what we've been doing at Kantar is thinking about the way in which we could ask these questions with a little less judgment. So if we take, for example, the question, what is your highest level of education? Instead of asking it in that way, we've been asking, what did you do after leaving school? Now, if you tell us you went on to do more education or further training, we followed that question up with, what type of further education did you take? So there's no judgment in the way we're asked this question. In fact, we've reframed the question and we've de-emphasized work on a list under things like looking for a job or taking up an apprenticeship. We split the question out into two, and so that secondary question allows us to get at that level of education detail that we do so often need for analysis. And the impact of this reimagined question is better quality data. So in every country we've tested this out in, we've seen a reduced number of people claiming to have a degree or a high level of education. And although the answers are higher than what we might expect in the population, we're certainly getting data that's closer to the truth. So So what's your working status? As I said, we're here kind of putting the emphasis on work as if it's somehow more valued in society than other lifestyles. But work combined with the word status seems to really enforce that feeling of a hierarchy. So we've reframed the question in some experiments we've run in different markets. And we've also expanded out the list to offer some more inclusive answers, some non-work related answers, things like bringing up a family, being a full-time carer, pursuing your own goals. And here we've actually quite intentionally included some examples like traveling, a creative pursuit, really to make people feel good about not being in employment and in turn feel comfortable to tell us that they're not working. So when we ask the question in this new way, again in every market we've tested it out in, we have less people feeling the need to state that they are working full-time. How much do you earn? I mean, Anoushka, what's your monthly household income? The problem with this question is it can kind of make people feel like they want to exaggerate how much they earn, and particularly depending on their status. So one of the tricks that we've been playing with to capture, I suppose, more truthful data is basically removing temptation from the respondents' path. So rather than showing respondents a whole long list of income bands that stretch up actually to a very high level of income, we're recommending clipping the list of income bands off at the median point for that particular country. So if you're someone who earns below the median, well, you don't feel so bad about telling us that you do. And if you earn above the median, well, there's an expanded out list of response options there for you to select from. And what we have found is that this does discourage people from kind of over-declaring the income that they earn. And really, we get it at a result that appears to be much closer to what we know to be the case in those markets.
So empathetic survey design is about helping respondents to feel comfortable about telling the truth. Some of the questions that we quite standardly ask in some of our surveys can make respondents feel a little bit uncomfortable about answering them truthfully. For example, some of the questions may be socially charged. There's a feeling for the respondent, there's a social expectation to answer these a certain way. Some of the questions might ask the respondents to reflect on their lifestyle in a way that actually makes them feel quite uncomfortable. Now, to approach this empathetically, we like to offer people a way out of answering these difficult questions. So, for example, if I ask you, Martha, do you smoke?
No, of course not.
By a straight yes, no kind of option, it's really putting the respondent on the spot. And they might feel a little bit judged for the reasons of the answers that they give. So what we like to do is to include some reasons why people may or may not do things. So for example, only occasionally I'm trying to give up. And by doing this, we make the respondent feel more comfortable about answering this truthfully. And in this particular example, we saw from the original questioning, 15% of people saying that they smoked. And this went up to 25% with the new method. So we're making them feel more comfortable to tell the truth. Now, questions around sustainability and the environment are really popular inclusions in surveys at the moment. And this example, do you buy organic, is no exception here. And again, by a yes, no, but there's a feeling that the respondent should answer these a certain way. So what we've done here again is offered a wider range of responses to make the respondent feel more at ease, less judged. And from a research perspective, by doing this, we're actually getting a more rounded picture of purchase behaviour. We're capturing some of the whys here. And in this particular example, people were overstating previously, so that to begin with, 15% with the original question were saying that they bought organic. But by expanding this list, we actually saw this drop to 5%. Now, empathetic survey design is also about putting respondents at ease. We see this all the time in the world of social media. People can feel like they need to put on a bit of a show about their lives. And from a research perspective, this can really impact the reliability of the data that we're collecting. In this example, we openly called this out in a humorous way to encourage respondents to be themselves. And expanding on this further, humour can be an extremely effective way in disarming respondents from this kind of behaviour. So in this example, we showed one set of respondents this meme, something that we can all identify with when we're asking them whether they recycle or not. And the results were quite staggering. in this example, 27% of people admitted they never recycle, versus just 1% of respondents who answered this without being shown the meme. So expanding on this further, this particular example, we ask respondents which household items they own. And this can be a really important indicator of social grade in some markets, so it's really important that the data that we collect is accurate. Now, our experience shows that the respondents can be a little bit tempted to inflate the truth at these questions. So what we have done here is we've preempted this. We've called it out, and we've explained to the respondent that we are just as keen to understand what they don't own as much as what they do. The message then that we're giving to the respondents is that it's really valuable for them to tell us the truth. And the results, the impact of this is more realistic data. In this example, we saw less overclaim of socially desirable household items and an increased reporting of everyday household items.
Empathetic survey design, it can also be about asking questions that don't involve respondents having to do a whole load of mental gymnastics just to answer. You know, as market researchers, it can be all too easy to ask what looks like a really easy, innocuous question, but in reality is super difficult for a respondent to think through and to answer. I mean, classic example of this is how many units of alcohol have you consumed in the last 7 days? As Caroline said at the start, you know, how many units of alcohol are there even in a drink? And what if that's a large glass of red wine or a small bottle of beer? And Anoushka, how many cocktails did you have at the summer party? Sometimes we really need to unpack the questions we're asking and maybe actually ask a few more. So that I could perhaps ask, how many glasses of red wine did you have? Was that a large glass of red wine? How many bottles of beer? And that's a lot easier than asking about units of alcohol. So really, we need to simplify the thinking process for the respondent so we can get, you know, closer to real behaviour. So in a survey we were running about alcohol consumption, we did just that. We unpacked the question, and in addition to that, we also pre-prompted respondents to get them thinking about their life. So we asked questions like, you know, on how many occasions this week did you go to a restaurant, to a bar? On how many occasions did you drink, you know, at an event or a party, or, you know, so on. Basically, we were seeding their memory to allow respondents to recall more effectively. So empathetic survey design, it can be about remembering we're all human, and sometimes we just need a little bit of help remembering. And actually, it's a really important technique that we thoroughly recommend using, and it's the crosshatch associated recall. So essentially, it's a technique we've been using a lot whenever we're needing to mine people's memories. It doesn't really matter what you're asking them about, whether it's brand consumption, for example. We've found that anything that involves memory recall is improved by using this technique. So in this study, what we ended up with was a method that was actually delivering much more reliable recall, and robust recall for that matter, than when we asked respondents simply to recall what they did yesterday without even the pre-prompts. Because actually it is quite hard to sometimes remember what you did the day before, especially if nothing of note took place. And yet by prompting people with the right kinds of questions, really helping them think through their day, think through their week, we found that people were able to recall very efficiently, actually, over the whole week previously. So kind of building on that, empathetic survey design, it's also about seeing brands through the eyes of the consumers to enable them to get closer to actual behaviour and recall the truth. It's about taking the time to really actively consider and evaluate how it is that the consumers see the world around them. So in market research, we often use logos to aid respondents' recall. But when we do this, we assume that the respondent can accurately identify the logo and, probably more importantly, correctly attribute it to a product that they may have engaged with. And yet we as consumers, we shop with our eyes, and we go into the supermarket and it's the product that kind of draws our attention. It's the product that stays within our memory. So in a survey we were running, asking people about their beverage consumption, we found that when we were asking people about Fever-Tree and depicted with the logo, hardly anyone was telling us that they were consuming Fever-Tree, and yet we knew at the time that it was a rapidly growing brand and a particularly popular tonic water for certain people. So when we had to think about how to improve the response of this question, we changed the visual prompt. Essentially, we started using, displaying the product range that was available at the time. So when we showed an image of the products instead of the logo, we found that the number of people who were able to tell us or recall that they consumed Fever Tree leapt from 2% to 8%. And so to a level that was far more in line with our expectations and actually corroborated with Nielsen's sales data. Because it was like, oh yeah, that's the product I buy whenever I'm, having gin at the weekend. So something we do try and do whenever we're trying to improve the quality of the data or the quality of response on our surveys is to really think about how to visually prompt people effectively. So if it's a brand like Coca-Cola, I probably don't need to worry. Almost everyone's aware of Coca-Cola. I might not even need to use the logo in the script or in the survey. But if we're asking people about a brand that's maybe new, it's emerging, maybe it's a niche brand, the visual prompting becomes critically important. So to the extent, if we take Jimmy's Iced Coffee here as one example, and we've got, when we moved away from showing the brand as a logo and into the product variants, if we had showed respondents just the green product or just the brown product, it's highly probable in our experience that the respondent forgets that there's even a blue product that they may have engaged with. So what we need to do is actually show a visual of the common product variants that are on display commonly at a supermarket or a shop. And this is the process of empathetic survey design. It's really about thinking through the eyes of the consumer, making it easier for them. And what we found with this approach is a 3 times uplift in recall of consumption and essentially bringing data up to a level that was far more reliable for analysis.
So empathetic survey design is about recognising that people like to feel that they're being listened to. As market researchers, sometimes it's really easy for us to get caught up in all of the information that we need to gather from the respondents, that the survey can become a bit of an interrogation, a bit of a monologue. So to approach this empathetically, the process needs to be more of a two-way conversation. From a respondent perspective, answering online surveys can sometimes feel like your answers are just disappearing into a black hole. Why are you asking me this question? What are you doing with the answers? And that's why at Kantar we're really passionate about finding techniques for turning surveys into conversations. Now, many of us already use follow-up questions in our surveys, but to design these surveys empathetically, we can take these one step further. In this experiment, we tailored our follow-up questions to enhance the conversational element of a survey. So by adding conversational interjections, that's interesting, we think this means, this is what other people said, the survey automatically becomes more three-dimensional, if you like, and more engaging for the respondent. In this example, by following up a very standard how long kind of question with a question that directly plays back the answer that the respondent gave, the survey starts to become more of a two-way conversation and the respondent starts to feel like they're being listened to. The question automatically becomes more specific to the respondent and the respondent then is more likely to give you a more considered answer. As you can see from the impact here, that the percentage of the respondents who are straight-lining reduced significantly with this approach. This leads us to believe that we have more engaged respondents that are really thinking about the answers that they're giving. Now, elastic band questions are a really powerful technique that we like to use to turn a survey into more of a conversation and less of an interrogation. So we'll look at some examples. So in this survey, we showed respondents, let's face it, 2 fairly unappetizing looking plates of food. And we asked them which of these would they pick. So Martha, which of these 2 lovely platefuls of food would you like?
Neither of those. It'll be a seafood platter or a barbecue for me, I think.
Exactly. So you can see by surprising respondents, by setting the scene somewhat, it sparks a thinking process, even if, like Martha, it only goes to show that they wouldn't want to eat either of these. So with this thinking process now underway, we followed this up and we asked respondents, OK, so now imagine that you're designing your own last meal. What would you order? So you can see by setting the scene, respondents start to think about things in a different way. And the outcome, we saw 30% more feedback with this approach than those that were asked this question without the elastic band approach. So in summary, elastic band questions are questions that spring a thinking process in the respondent. They're an effective way to introduce a bit of fun into the survey, but they really get respondents to think about things in a different way, and we see that more extensive feedback is given. Now, empathetic survey design is about placing your trust in respondents. We like to empower our respondents to give their feedback, For example here, what would you say to the people launching this product? And an important part of this is explaining to respondents why their feedback is so important to us. So we pulled all of this together in this particular example. So for this study on nappy wipes, we applied this very technique to a very standard open-ended likes and dislikes question. We start by setting the scene. The average parent changes over 1,000 nappies. This makes it relevant to the respondent. We then empower them, saying that this makes you a bit of an expert. And then we follow this up by telling them why their input is so valuable here. We want to improve baby wipes for future generations. And additionally in this survey, we showed an image to the respondents of a baby having its nappy changed. So this automatically transports the respondent to that particular experience. By putting all of these things together, we saw verbatims grow from just a few words of these questions to as much as a paragraph of feedback.
Probably the most critical thing when thinking about empathetic survey design is about being respectful of people, their time and their concentration spans, really being conscious of what it is in a survey that annoys people. So Anoushka, imagine I ask you to identify which of these brands you're aware of. But I show you not one list, but I go on to show you 8 lists of brands, albeit organised by specific categories. But I mean, it turns out you're aware of pretty much every single one of these brands, as were 9 in 10 people in this particular study, as it turns out. So having had to click through all of those lists of brands and make your selection, how are you feeling?
Pretty exhausting, quite boring.
Yeah, exactly. But imagine I then go on to ask you a second question. So which of these brands have you drunk in the last 12 months? Now, not only am I asking you to recall what you've drunk in the last 12 months, I'm going to have to show you this list and the other 8 lists that I showed you before because you selected nearly every code before. Now, I'm also trying to get you to remember all the drinks that you drank in the last 12 months. Now, I don't know about you, but I can barely remember the drinks I had in the last month, let alone the last 12 months. Imagine I then went on to ask you some further questions. So which of these brands did you drink in the last 3 months? In the last week? Yesterday? Now, I wouldn't blame you for just giving up thinking. Now, this is a real-life scenario. It is a really commonplace one, unfortunately. And yet with an approach like this, all we're doing is creating an emotional response in panelists, and that is one of anger, one of frustration, one of annoyance. And the only way the panelist is going to pay us back is by not concentrating. They're going to give us poor quality data. They're just going to click through any question, any answer to get to the end as fast as possible. And so how do we tackle this? Well, we've been challenging our clients to really truly consider what it is they need to know to drive effective business decisions. Do they really need to know what percentage of the population is aware of Coke, of Amazon, of Nike, of Apple? Everyone's aware of these brands. And can people truly remember what it is they did over the last year? What they bought, what they consumed? Certainly this is harder for some categories than others. It might be easier actually to, answer, when did you most recently drink Coke? Was that in the last day, the last week, and so on? So when we were faced with this particular challenge on our beverage survey, what we did was create a tiered class system of brands, essentially splitting the brands out into groups based on the level of awareness we knew that they had. So for the brands that most people were aware of, we didn't need to ask them about awareness. We simply skipped that question and asked them, when did you most recently drink this product? So was it in the last day, the last week, and so on. For the lesser known brands, we instead asked them, which of these brands have you ever tried or do you drink? So these clustered groups of brands offered a simplified piece of thinking by recognizing the kind of subtle delineations we all make as consumers. In addition to these groupings, we also added a question up front in the survey that enabled us to capture category involvement and basically to ensure we didn't waste anyone's time asking them about brands they don't consume. Really, we kept the content relevant to the respondent. And so by designing our survey with empathy, we found we were able to cut the brand list an individual respondent would see in half, and we ended up with data that was far more reliable and actually better in line as well with Nielsen's sales data. And it should be noted that the most improvements were gained by those lesser known brands, those kind of new and emerging brands that were really suffering in the kind of more traditional approach.
Now finally, empathetic survey design is about realising that our respondents are real people. Respondents are human beings. We inherently like to have fun. People like to be challenged and they like to think about things in new and different ways. So in this example, we took the very standard prompted brand awareness question that we see in most of our surveys and we turned it on its head into a game. So we showed respondents a list of brands one by one, some of which were real and some of which are fake. Now this challenged the respondents kind of game show style to identify whether they were real or fake. So by turning this very standard question into a fun and engaging game, we're tapping into that competitive nature of humans. People like to be challenged, and you know what? People like to get things right. And the impact of this gamified approach, we saw much more accurate awareness levels compared to the traditional question. So in short, introducing a little bit of fun into surveys improves the respondent experience. It gets respondents to think about things in a new and a different way. This in turn increases respondent engagement and helps us as researchers to elicit more meaningful feedback.
So one of the impacts that COVID has forced us into over the past 18 months is living in a much more virtual world. And the reality is that consumers' digital expectations have really increased and heightened. Peloton's a great example. They didn't just create a better bike, they created a better experience. And frankly, our surveys are no exception. We really have to work much harder now to earn the right to share people's precious time and precious data. So when it comes to really building engaging surveys that warrant a true investment of time and engagement from our panellists, let's really make sure that empathy sits at the core of everything we do. And to help you with that, we've put together this very simple checklist that really, although it looks quite straightforward and quite simple and obvious, it really will encompass all the great results that Anoushka and Martha have taken you through to ensure that actually, when it comes to your survey design and the data that you draw out of it, it's representative, it's actionable, and it's meaningful.
Okay, hi. So as you can see, this is neither Caroline or Anoushka. They couldn't join me here today following the recording from last week. So John kindly agreed to step in. I wrangled him in from the last presentation. And as it so happens, he's a bit of an expert on this area. So we've got some questions. The first I will ask is, or I'll read, is this seems a bit like an art form. How do you manage those who think they know better, have asked things in a set way for years?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, go ahead, you can start there.
I think we have to accept that it is a bit of an art form, writing surveys. We tend to think that anyone can write a survey, and I don't think you make that assumption about writing a film script or creating an advert. And I think that training people can be trained how to write better surveys, and hopefully this is a type of session that helps you to learn how to write better surveys. But as for, you know, I don't know that clients but do behave that way, to be honest. Most people embrace ideas, and I think the best way to make decisions about using these techniques is using evidence and pilot. I'm a really big fan of piloting techniques, seeing an old technique and new technique side by side, and really making decisions as to how much it improves the data, and if it's effective, you adopt it, and if it's not, then you can stick to existing techniques and just using evidence to make those types of decisions.
Brilliant. So how can we use empathetic survey design in a tracker study? So I mean, I would say that it can work effectively as well in a tracker as an ad hoc piece of research. I think there are some considerations that need to be in mind. So obviously with the tracker, continuity of key metrics is really critical. You want to be able to trend data and compare data wave on wave. So it might be that if we're setting up a new tracker, for example, or empathetic survey design could be built into the process from the start, and actually you just have those techniques at play, and you ensure that those same questions and formats are used in the survey throughout the tracker. I suppose if you're working with a tracker that is already in existence, or like any change, you're going to impact the trend in the data. So it might be that you have to consider the timing at which you're prepared to make that change, because that data comparability may be impacted. Do you have anything to add?
No, only that I think that these sorts of techniques are really, really valuable and important for tracking, because if you're going to be repeating the study, and setting it out over and over again, think about the numbers. How much effort would you put into produce a PowerPoint presentation if you're presenting to 20 or 30 people? I suspect you probably put in more effort if you're presenting to 100 people. Well, if you think about the numbers involved, you're sending out a survey to 500 people a wave. If you're doing that imagine you were talking to 10,000 people. You probably want to put a bit more effort into the survey design, and I think that's the way you need to think about for trackers. These types of ideas are really valuable.
And I suppose some of the ideas when we think about empathetic survey design are there to make the survey kind of more engaging and sometimes shorter, and so more concise for the respondent to get at that high quality data. And so that can be quite powerful in a tracker as well when it's something you're rolling weekly or monthly. So many of these issues vary greatly by market. What should you do to minimize the risk you alienate respondents in markets you are less familiar with? Well, I think the first thing I'd say to that is at the core of empathetic survey design is about considering these challenges or these nuances in a market. So really being empathetic towards the panelists that you're engaging. And so that would be, that's inbuilt into the approach, into the mindset. So we could potentially work with our counterparts in different markets to understand what differences we might need to keep in mind when we're building that survey or tailoring that survey for a particular market. And you've done some research, I believe, testing that out.
Yeah, I think it's really important adapting surveys to be sympathetic to the market. And we did a really big global media tracking study where we used honesty priming techniques we described. But what we did was that we very carefully adapted some of the visual stimulus material so that in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, we had Middle East, we had specifically adapted images that represented the groups of people we were talking to. And I think that type of thing is really important to make a connection with an audience. You have to show things that they can relate to. So, it wasn't a massive. It's not like we had to adapt every single survey, but we had 4 variants, 5 variants of the visual stimulus that we spread in different parts of the world. So that's probably an example of that. I've done a lot of research to look at, for example, the impact of gamification techniques in different countries. And I published an SMR paper called Can Gamification Cross Continents? And I think it can. And the techniques of things like the example we used of fake brands, that fake brand works in every country I've ever tested it out in equally well. And I think everyone responds in kind to a more fun survey experience. But yes, I think to Martha's point, I think it's really important to think about how the survey lands at a different cultural level and adapting it subtly.
So someone has said they like the turning surveys into conversations idea. How much of this can you use AI for, or does this all have to be scripted? So I think you even talked about this in your previous presentation, actually.
Yeah, I think that the future of surveys is a more conversational approach and using API calls that can interpret what people are saying and then feed back, thematic questions based upon the types of things people are talking about. It does require a lot more considered setup, and there is work involved in doing that. And I think the technological interpretation of what people are saying is kind of evolving as AI linguistic analysis techniques are evolving. So I think we're at the cusp of integrating that into more mainstream surveys. It's already been used in chatbots quite considerably, but in more traditional surveys, it's less. It's certainly it's there to be exploited, I think.
So if we know that the repetitive nature of these questions annoy, why do we still see so many surveys using them? Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind there is change takes time, and it's difficult sometimes for people to change. There could be budgetary considerations, could be time considerations. It can be quite easy, and just habit maybe, but can be quite easy just to recycle questions that have been used in other questions or other surveys that a company has run. But it also could be a product of the size of the market research landscape.
Yeah, it's a big industry. It's difficult for the whole industry to wholesale change. Yes, I think, yes.
Okay. How can you avoid one-word answers in open box questions or silly responses? Well, I think some of the techniques that we talked about today are really designed to try and get at more considered responses. So asking things either, an elastic band technique, for example, where you bring a thinking process and you get people to kind of consider, to really deeply consider the response to a question. You probably will still get some people keyboard smashing or giving one-word responses, because that's unfortunately in some people's nature. But I think by designing the survey in a way that you're encouraging deeper thought, we've seen it give us responses. In some instances, we end up with paragraphs of responses, or certainly more people responding as well to an open-ended question.
Yeah, I think it's all down to the technique you ask the questions, and yeah, the bountiful. The more you invest in thinking about how you design the question and make it interesting, the less likely they are to give you one-word answers. I think there's some structural things. For example, you can navigate people into giving you more than one answer. So you might say, please don't write more than 100 words, which might, I've used it. Please don't write more than 50 words, but can you give a short explanation of why? And that word 50 anchors people to write more than one or two words, things like that.
So are you seeing more respondents dropping out or less interested in surveys these days? I suppose we have been seeing that. I don't know for sure. I don't know if we've tracked that over time within Kantar.
Well, I think, it's an industry problem in that the response rates from surveys have been falling over the last decade or two, I'm afraid. And people are becoming, I suppose, more trained to the survey experience and learning that, that often there's little reward for them giving considered feedback. And so a lot of people learn that it's easy just to skip through a survey. And so it's probably one of the underlying motivations for a lot of this work is to try and address that issue, is that we have a responsibility to make surveys more interesting consumer experiences in the whole industry. And so, this is really what this presentation is about.
So we've got another question. So where does innovation in surveys and questionnaires come from most? Agencies or big clients? Oh, well.
Well, some of our clients are just fantastically open to ideas, and they really push along innovation and really embrace it. And I think that the best collaborations are where you've got a client that's really up to experiment, and I think also having a team of people who are there to experience in running pilots and experimentation also helps. I think having dedicated resources to play, I suppose, with the survey experience, it helps facilitate that process. And so I think we're definitely in a lot better position to experiment than a client, because we've got access to surveys and sample and so on to experiment with.
And we will often do a bit of research on research.
Yeah.
Right? So we can,
Yeah.
So another question then is around the length of time it takes now to design surveys with empathy. Is it taking longer to design it in the first instance, and also for a respondent to answer it? Well, I think in terms of the respondent experience, a lot of the techniques we're talking about today were actually about making that experience, shorter in a way, like thinking about really being respectful of people's time and their concentration span. So in a way, actually designing with empathy from the respondent experience is going to take them less time to respond, complete a survey. For some questions, we're actually getting respondents to, consider the answer more deeply, so they might spend a bit more time considering that answer. But that helps us get at that higher quality data or more rich response.
I think we're out of time.
Oh, we're out of time. Okay, there we go.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you for your time, for watching.